afternoon. I hereby call this June the 10th meeting of the Public Safety Committee to order. I will one day have this added to our agenda, but our first unofficial item is always to thank our police department, our fire department, and our emergency management departments for the work that you do to keep our communities safe and secure. I know you hear it all the time, but if you don't, you will hear it here. So we thank you and we honor you for your service. With that being said, members of the committee, we have one item on the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Move to approve.
Is there a second? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposers likewise. That is unanimous. We have one item on the the general agenda. Madam Clerk, if you read that item, please.
Item G1, the adoption of ordinance amending Chapter 2, Article 3, entitled Boards and Commissions of the Winston-Salem City Code, creating the Civil Service Board of the City of Winston-Salem.
Thank you. Members of the committee, as you are aware, we have been mandated by the General Assembly to create this Civil Service Board. Our attorney's office, led by Attorney Carmen, has kept us updated on this item. There is a need to have action today, and I'll turn it over to Attorney Carmen to give a presentation.
Thank you, Chair Taylor. Good afternoon, Chair Taylor, committee members, and council members.
Good afternoon.
I think this is probably the third report on this legislation, so I will go through some of the slides briefly. As we've discussed before, the legislation basically was enacted in August of last year, creating the Civil Service Board, or the legislation mandating that the city create the Civil Service Board. Since that time, my office, the city manager's office, the clerk's office, budget office have worked together on the ordinance. We've been in contact with, as I said before, the city attorney's office in Asheville and Greensboro, and Greensboro is working on their version of the ordinance as well. I think, however, we are probably ahead of the folks in Greensboro. Let's see. There was some discussion last time about the similarities between the Citizen Police Review Board and the Civil Service Board. Wanted to point out again, the Citizen Police Review Board, it was created in 1993 by City Council pursuant to general authority to create boards and commissions. And that Citizen Police Review Board basically hears complaints filed by citizens against police officers and police department employees. That board makes recommendations to the city manager's office whenever there's a hearing held by that board. And that board initially, before deciding to hold a hearing, will look at the case file to determine whether or not a hearing is appropriate. And if they decide that a hearing is appropriate, again, the recommendations are made to the city manager, who makes the final decision. And that is different from the Civil Service Board, which can, in fact, make the final decision with respect to matters that can be appealed to said board, which I'll go over shortly. But they can basically make the final decision and even overturn the city manager's decision. And then anyone dissatisfied with the decision of the Civil Service Board can appeal that decision to the Forsyth County Superior Court.
Madam Attorney, if I may, before we get to the next concern, are there any questions or comments? Please continue.
Okay, thank you. One other thing I mentioned last time is the question about whether or not you can have a local act mandating that a city create a civil service board in light of a provision in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 24(1)J, which prohibits local acts regarding labor. But at this point, I assume we're moving forward. One other point in terms of similarities or dissimilarities between the CSB and CPRB is that the Civil Service Board, unlike the Citizen Police Review Board, does not have subpoena power. And as some of you may recall, in '93 and a couple of years after that, City Council asked the General Assembly to give the Citizen Police Review Board subpoena power, and that was denied. The other thing is that the Citizen Police Review Board doesn't have the ability to commence an investigation on its own. A complaint has to be filed by a citizen against a police department employee, and that citizen, once they get the letter from the chief, has to indicate that they're dissatisfied with the chief's disposition of that case and appeal it to the Citizen Police Review Board. Otherwise, the Citizen Police Review Board can't reach in and grab a complaint on its own. The Civil Service Board has the independent authority to commence an investigation as outlined in the legislation and in the ordinance. As you'll see in the legislation and the ordinance, the Civil Service Board has jurisdiction as it relates to employees in the classified service of the city of Winston-Salem. So what does that mean? Basically, it's employees, all officers and employees of the city police department and city fire department except the chief of police, deputy chief of police, assistant chiefs of police, the fire chief, deputy fire chief, and assistant fire chiefs. And it does not apply to probationary employees during that probationary period. Sworn officers or anyone working for the police department? It's all employees of the police department. We had some question, I guess, when we were initially drafting the ordinance, if it related to just sworn police officers and certified firefighters. You may recall I actually had some conversation with the folks in legislative drafting to get an understanding as to whom it applied, and they assured me that employees meant all employees, certified or not, except for those people or officers and employees specifically excluded, like the fire chief, the police chief, and their deputies and their assistants. Other than that, it applies to everybody in the police and fire department.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Attorney Carmen?
So what actions does the hearing board have, or Civil Service Board have the ability to hear? Basically, they have the ability to hear appeals relating to employees that have been discharged or from employees that have been discharged, suspended, reduced in rank, transferred against his or her will, or denied any promotion or raise in pay which he or she would be entitled to. So, for example, if an employee gets a written reprimand, that can't be appealed to the Civil Service Board. It has to be one of the actions listed. And as I mentioned before, the Civil Service Board has the ability to undertake investigations concerning the operation and enforcement of the provisions of the Civil Service Board legislation, the rules established pursuant to the authority granted by the Act, and the conditions of the classified service of the city, which at this point, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it's straight out of the legislation. And as I mentioned before, the board has the Civil Service Board has the ability to make rules of procedure. Those rules must be, however, be approved by City Council. And so we envision once the board is impaneled, and we'll talk about the eligibility requirements and so forth, but once that board is impaneled, the first action that board will need to take will be to basically decide on its meeting schedule and then get to work on the rules of procedure. So the legislation and thus the ordinance basically provides the process for electing, selecting, and appointing members of the Civil Service Board. And the city manager basically is going to be in charge or oversee that process. And this is just a general overview of the process. Like most positions on city boards and commissions, usually there's an advertisement in the paper soliciting interest. And so we envision that that process will take place through the city manager and city clerk's office with respect to the Civil Service Board, soliciting at least 5 residents, city residents, who are interested in serving on that board. And we envision the process being one by which the person or citizen that's interested in serving would indicate whether or not they want to be the police representative or the fire representative. Because as you will see later, basically there are 5 members. One is selected or elected by members of the classified service in the police department. One is elected by members of the classified service in the fire department, and then one is basically selected by mutual agreement of the police chief and fire chief, and then the city council selects one member. The city council also appoints the chair, and then the board itself, the 4-member board, chooses a 5th member. So hopefully we'll get enough, at least 5 interested residents who are interested in serving on the board. I'm going to skip over that briefly. And again, pursuant to the ordinance, the city manager will oversee the process, including the hours for the polls, hours of operation, the location for the polls, and so forth. Again, briefly, 5 members on the board. They serve 2-year terms. As I mentioned before, it's not clear from the legislation that council can put or place a limit on the number of terms like it does for other boards and commissions. Generally, in the code, you can serve 2 terms, then you have to have a lapse in service on that board before you can serve a 3rd term, another term. Or, of course, you could also have a lapse in service for 1 year if you want to serve on a different board. So that lapse in service provision, at this point in time, we're not certain that it can be applied to this board. So at this point, I've not included that language. So they can serve an unlimited number of terms, 2-year terms. Does that make sense?
It does. Councilman Mundy.
I know some organizations have had trouble with all terms ending at the same time. Is there any thought to staggering terms, or are we even able to do that since everybody has to start at the same time?
The legislation doesn't really provide for staggered terms, so everybody's term at this point will end at the same time.
So if everybody served 2 terms, everybody would have to leave, and we would have 5 new people.
Theoretically, everybody's term would end at the same time, and then you start the process all over again.
Okay, thank you.
And in theory, you would start that process before their terms actually expire, so you can have folks ready to take over.
Thank you.
Let's see. Again, as I mentioned before, once the board is installed, and we envision the board members being required to take an oath of office, they would work on the meeting schedule, select their vice chair, council appoints the chair, and then get to work on the rules of procedure. As I mentioned before, the city clerk will serve as the secretary to the Civil Service Board. And then there's a provision about my office serving as legal counsel if 4 members of the board so desire. Otherwise, they'll put together a roster of attorneys they want to represent the board for my review. And in light of such, you'll see, or if you haven't already, there's a line item in the budget for the Civil Service Board, because you have to fund that board per the law. And I think it's $50,000. So at this point, unless there are questions or concerns, we can take the ordinance to City Council on June 17th or bring it to City Council in August. It's up to the committee. And then after the ordinance is approved, we'll get to work on the election, selection, appointment process. And then after that, again, once they're installed, we'll get working on the training, and then they'll get the rules and move forward. And of course, again, the rules have to be approved by City Council.
Thank you, Attorney Carmen. Any questions for Attorney Carmen? Councilmember Larson.
The only thing that confuses me a little bit is to try to differentiate what is regulated by the legislation of Raleigh and then what we have been laid on top of that to implement the program. Is there a way to differentiate what decisions are being made by the local council for the implementation of this?
Most of the items in the ordinance are dictated by the legislation itself. The only thing that I guess, council or the city has some flexibility over is the election process and how that would take place. But for the most part, what you see in the ordinance came right out of the legislation itself. But we kind of use the existing processes to do the election, selection, appointment process that's dictated by the legislation.
The 5-member committee and the 2-year term is dictated by the state legislation.
That is correct.
Have you exhausted your questions, Councilman Larson?
That's it.
Members of the committee, we do have a decision to make. As we heard from our attorney, it appears that we could take this item up once it's voted today on June the 17th. We don't meet in July, or we could wait till August to do this. So I guess I'd ask, what's the pleasure of the committee?
I have one more question for that.
You have the floor, sir.
I had one more question as it relates to the ability to meet remotely or by Zoom, which may impact someone's willingness to serve. Did you talk about that? I didn't.
I did not. I'll have to go back and look. I don't recall anything in the legislation that would preclude them from meeting remotely. But generally, when you're doing hearings, my preference would be.
It was around 50,000, and
I think that's right.
is that right? And does that include any outside counsel that might be necessary, or would that be something we'd have to deal with as it occurs?
The bulk of that is meant for outside legal counsel.
Okay, and so, but the staff for managing this, the voting comes from the city manager's office, but the secretary and other administrations is through the city clerk, is that right?
Right. It's probably best said as a combination between the city manager's office, city clerk's office, and my office. But the city clerk's office serves as secretary to the Civil Service Board, and the city manager will basically, with the clerk's office, oversee that selection appointment process.
That election process is very complicated, or it has lots of steps. So does that budget also, could part of it be used for any part-time staff that might be needed to assist the city clerk or the city manager's office?
I'll let the manager answer that question.
It could be, but we believe we could handle that.
Okay, yeah.
Say again, I'm sorry.
Yes, if we need extra help in doing that, the 50,000 could be used towards that as well. But at this point, we're not anticipating that.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, I just think that this is such a complicated and such detailed new kind of.
Individual candidates to choose from. It seems to me, it sounds like what we're doing, if we're asking for citizens to come forth and volunteer, I assume there's some sort of written document saying their interest or their qualifications or whatever that would be useful in that process for selection.
Part of the notification process will include the eligibility criteria, i.e. you have to be a city resident, you cannot be a current employee. In fact, I think it's 7 years you have to have been away from city employment to be eligible. And also you can't have a conflict of interest as defined in the ordinance and the legislation.
If an individual is not on the list that's qualified, let's say the police or the fire, or the mayor or somebody thinks should be on the list, could recruit that person. Is there anything to preclude that from happening?
If you're asking whether or not additional names beyond those that are submitted through this process can be considered, the answer is yes, as long as they meet the eligibility criteria.
Agree.
But just to clarify, I think that's only for council's appointee. For the names that would go forth on the ballot, that would have to be done in advance. And so those names we'd have to have. So if somebody came up afterwards and said, well, I would be willing to do that, that would only be eligible for either the council to appoint or the police and fire chief to appoint.
But there's a write-in process too for the election. But again, if a person that's not on that list is interested, they have to let us know in advance so we can scrub them and make sure they meet the eligibility criteria before the election takes place.
So there is a vetting of some sort that occurs. What I'm getting at is that the process of developing this list is going to be somewhat cumbersome in the sense of the time it'll take to get the notifications out, to allow adequate time for candidates to come forward, to understand, for the public to understand what the obligations of this committee is going to be. There's a variety of things that are going to slow the process down. So, the 30 days on the front end may not make that much difference if we're getting the word out. I imagine it's going to take 30 days just to go through the selection process, advertising and developing the criteria for selecting the list of candidates. If we don't get 5 candidates, then what happens?
May have to go back out again, because I think we need at least 5, because you got to have a 5-member board. But you're right, it will take some time and effort. I mean, the criteria is pretty much set, but it will take some time and effort to identify folks, volunteers, for those positions.
Because I don't think the public's very much aware of this, or even what the responsibilities of this committee is going to be, which are substantial and empowered with some powers that even the city manager should be concerned about. So I guess I'm concerned that we make sure we get a good list of people and we don't rush the process just to get the 5 slots filled.
I mean, it is the process, though. We'll advertise and see what kind of responses we receive from that advertisement, and if we don't receive enough, we'll go back out again. And also, there's always soliciting the names from council members and others ahead of time as well. But it will be, I have no reason to think we won't get at least 5 members, but it will be a time-consuming process. Then, of course, we also have to give notice to the employees as to when the election will take place, and that time period is prescribed within the legislation and the ordinance as well.
Councilmember Mundy.
I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but I think we're making some assumptions without knowing for sure. From a legal standpoint, you said it's not a problem to wait. I wonder if the clerk's office feels one way or the other. And then I guess my last question is for the city manager. If you have had or anyone has had conversations with representatives from the fire department or the police department for them to weigh in on what timing they would prefer.
I could say we have not had conversations, but the attorney's office, and I know there's been conversation with the 2 chiefs about looking at the ordinance, but there's not been a timing discussion that I'm aware of.
I've not had that specific discussion with members of the classified service in terms of the timing, but just from comments that have been made, reported anyway, there is interest in moving forward with this.
Yeah, and I think that's where we get the crux is maybe better for staff, other staff to prolong it a little bit, better for our public safety folks to move forward. But
I mean, June it works fine for me. I mean, we'll do what's necessary to bring it into fruition, regardless of when you all approve it. So June is fine.
So I tell you what, the city manager's been mentioned a couple of times, and you've made several comments. My apologies for not recognizing you in advance. Do you have any other thoughts or comments that you want to add to discussion before we get a motion on the floor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I will tell you that this was obviously in process before I got here. I know that the city attorney's office and the staff members have put a lot of time and effort into vetting the ordinance to make it as easy as possible to implement. Some of the questions that were asked will probably be dealt with in the rules and procedures once the committee is actually established. Things like remote meetings, that'll likely be a part of their bylaws of how they're going to conduct business. I would agree with Councilmember Scipio. I don't know what level of items or actions might come to this board, whether there'll be many or just a few or none. So I think time will tell what has to happen, what will happen in that part. But we are, as the attorney Carmen said, we're ahead of Greensboro, so it's not like we're lagging anybody else.
Which is how I like it.
Right. Well, we're mostly ahead of them in pretty much everything we do, but in this case, we definitely are ahead of them. So I think it's council's prerogative. You have to adopt the ordinance before we take any next steps. That's right. So this is the next step for you to decide if this ordinance, which most of it has been prescribed by law, is acceptable to you.
Members of the committee and council, we've heard from our city manager, we've heard from our capable city attorney. Let's get a motion on the floor. Is there a motion to approve item G1?
I have a substitute motion.
Okay,
I don't think you have a motion yet, though.
yeah, I was going to say we got to get a motion on the floor to do a substitute, but is there a motion to approve item G1?
So moved.
Is there a second? I'll second it for discussion. Councilmember Mundy.
Since there is some concern that's been expressed, and did you have a strong opinion, Councilmember Burke, one way or the other? Okay. I would move that we move this forward to the full council on June 17th so that everyone has an opportunity to weigh in and vote on the final outcome, and that's just a week. And if there are concerns about timing, we could hear about it then.
Right.
Madam Attorney, your comments?
I have no comments.
So the motion on the floor is to move this item forward without a recommendation to the full council for the June 17th meeting. Is that correct?
Yes, that's mine.
We had a motion on the floor. Now we have a substitute motion, which needs a second. Is there a second to the substitute motion? Okay, I will second it. The substitute motion. Is there any discussion on the substitute motion?
I have a question about the motion generally.
Councilmember Larson is recognized.
All right, yes, we're going to move this thing along, but could you tell me what cities, this legislation was run through Raleigh. What are the cities, Asheville, Greensboro, and Winston-Salem? Are we the only cities that are dealing with this now?
The two cities that have to deal with it at the present time are Winston-Salem and Greensboro. Asheville already has a civil service board, as well as, I believe, Durham, Charlotte, and maybe a few other cities. But this legislation just pertains to Winston-Salem and Greensboro.
Second question, I guess, is what input has the police department or fire department had in this review of this legal document? Have they been involved in the discussions?
I shared the same information essentially that I shared with you all with both the police chief and fire chief.
Do we have any comments from the people that are most impacted by this?
No comments. I mean, it's pretty much prescribed by the legislation, so I don't know that there's much to be said.
Right.
Okay.
And there's a safety net in that if there's still concerns on June 17th, we're not saying that it has to be approved. We're just saying that we want that on the agenda for the 17th. So I feel if there are concerns, we can address them then. And if it needs to be delayed, we have the option to do that then.
All right, the motion on the floor is a substitute motion to move this item forward to the full council for June the 17th. All in favor of the substitute motion to do so, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposers, likewise. Well, we've got two votes here. If we need to show it by show of hands, we can do that. But we have two votes in favor of the motion, and if we'll call the question again. If you could just please speak up so we can be clear. Attorney Carmen.
Let me understand, so what is the motion, to move it forward without?
Without recommendation
Okay.
to the June 17th meeting of the Winston-Salem City Council. We have two votes, but I didn't hear from Councilmember Larson or Councilmember Burke. So we need to be a little bit more clear, which is why I'm recalling the question.
Okay.
So we'll recall the question. We will move this item forward without recommendation to June 17th by show of hands. All in favor of doing that, please raise your hand now. Opposers?
I'm moving forward.
So it is unanimous. We will move this item forward without recommendation to the June 17th meeting of the City Council. We earned our paychecks today. Is there any further business that should be considered for the good of the order? Our consent and our general agenda items have been completed. There's no further business. Consider this meeting to be adjourned. Thank you.
Very good.